Dr. Elena Wright sat in the dimly lit room of the Cambridge University archives, her eyes scanning the stack of photographs that had just arrived. The faint hum of the scanner filled the silence as she adjusted her glasses, carefully reading the faded pencil markings on the back of the first photograph. April 1911. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the image, the corners slightly curled from age. The Massachusetts Historical Society had sent over the collection as part of a collaborative project to preserve forgotten pieces of American history, and as the head of the Digital Preservation Department, Dr. Wright had seen her fair share of old photographs. Yet something about this particular set caught her attention. The first image depicted a grand Victorian house, its once majestic architecture now shrouded in the muted tones of the photograph. Even through the lens of time, the home seemed imposing, its beauty tinged with an eerie quality that Dr. Wright couldn't quite place. She placed the image under the scanner, the quiet whirring of the machine almost soothing against the weight of her curiosity. As she adjusted the settings and the image slowly appeared on her computer screen, she noticed a subtle detail. A child standing on the porch, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, wearing a pristine white dress with a high collar, common for the Edwardian era. Her hair was neatly arranged in ringlets, the smile on her face radiant. In her arms, she clutched a porcelain doll. It was a typical photograph for the time, and yet something was wrong. The girl's expression was too lively, too genuine, especially for the long exposure photographs of that era. Most children in these types of photographs were posed seriously, their expressions frozen for the sake of the exposure time. But this little girl's smile wasn't just for the camera. It was real. It was as though her gaze reached beyond the lens, beyond the photographer, into something Dr. Wright could not yet comprehend. Dr. Wright! A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Marcus Chen, her research assistant, standing in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee. It's almost 8 p.m. You've been here since morning. Are you okay? He looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. She smiled, rubbing her tired eyes. I lost track of time, she replied, glancing back at the photograph on the screen. This collection is more fascinating than I anticipated. Marcus peered over her shoulder at the screen. Another family archive? Yes, the Blackwood family, Dr. Wright said, gesturing to the photograph of the little girl. This one, though, there's something strange about it. Look at her eyes. Marcus leaned in, squinting at the image. Creepy doll, he remarked with a half-hearted chuckle. Old porcelain dolls always have that unsettling look to them. Dr. Wright nodded, but there was a lingering unease in her voice. It's not just the doll. It's her eyes. They're not looking at the camera. It's as if she's seeing something beyond the photographer. A chill ran down her spine as the realization dawned. There was more to this photograph than a simple family portrait. It held a secret, a mystery that had yet to unfold. Before we continue with the investigation into the Blackwood family and the doll's sinister presence, be sure to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more chilling tales and deep dives into history's most haunting mysteries. Dr. Wright leaned in closer to the screen, her fingers dancing over the keyboard as she zoomed in on the photograph of the little girl. The more she examined the image, the more unsettling it became. The doll in the girl's arms was pristine, its porcelain skin almost glowing under the faint light of the scanner. But it wasn't just the doll's appearance that caught her attention. It was the detail in the girl's eyes. They seemed to shimmer, as if alive, filled with a depth that didn't belong in a child's gaze. She zoomed in even further, focusing on the doll's face. The delicate painted features were unmistakable. Rosy cheeks, red lips, and eyes that almost seemed to gleam with life. In the dim light of the archive room, Dr. Wright's skin prickled as she studied the doll's eyes. They weren't just painted in the traditional fashion. They appeared to have depth, reflecting light as real eyes would. But that was impossible. Porcelain dolls from this era had fixed, painted eyes, and none of them exhibited such realistic qualities. Marcus, come look at this, she called out, her voice tinged with a mix of intrigue and discomfort. Marcus walked over to her desk, leaning in to examine the screen. He gave a small laugh as he peered at the photograph. "Those eyes are freaky," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Are you telling me this doll is somehow different from the others?" Dr. Wright didn't respond right away. Instead, she enhanced the image further, isolating the doll's face and its eyes. The more she magnified the image, the more the details became clearer. The reflection in the doll's eyes seemed to suggest that it was looking at something, or someone, just beyond the frame. Not just any reflection, but one that appeared far too lifelike to belong to a simple porcelain figure. "Do you see that?" Dr. Wright asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the doll is watching something else, something outside the frame." Marcus squinted at the screen, then shook his head, uncertain. "It's probably just the lighting or a trick of the scanner." Dr. Wright wasn't convinced. "I've worked with enough old photographs to know when something's off. This is different." As she continued analyzing the image, Dr. Wright's mind wandered. The photograph had been taken in 1911, only months before the Blackwood family tragedy. And yet there was something unnervingly timeless about it. The girl's smile seemed genuine, too genuine for a photograph taken during that period. Children were often instructed to hold a serious pose for the long exposure times required back then. But Amelia's expression was different. There was an emotion in her eyes that seemed too real, too alive for a mere photograph. "This doll, it's not just a toy," Dr. Wright muttered, more to herself than to Marcus. "There's something about it, something that doesn't fit." Marcus, still unconvinced, took a step back. "It's just a doll, Dr. Wright. We've seen hundreds of these old photos. Maybe there's something about this one that stands out because you're looking for it." Dr. Wright shook her head, her thoughts swirling. "No, it's more than that. This doll. The way its eyes look, the way it's positioned in her arms. It's not just a part of the photograph. It's something else. Something I need to understand." She sat back in her chair, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. As the photo came into sharper focus, she noticed a faint shadow in the background of the image. The Victorian house loomed large in the distance, its grand structure almost swallowing up the porch where Amelia stood. The shadows of the house seemed to stretch unnaturally, the light from the sun casting long, menacing shapes across the porch. "Look at the shadows behind her," Dr. Wright said, drawing Marcus's attention to the dark, elongated lines creeping toward the girl. "It's as though the house itself is looming over her, watching her." Marcus looked again, his skepticism waning slightly. "That's odd." But Dr. Wright wasn't finished. "I want to see if there are any other photographs of Amelia with the doll," she said, as her fingers worked quickly to search through the rest of the collection. The next image that appeared was another photograph of the Blackwood home. It was a formal portrait, this time showing Amelia standing stiffly between her parents. But there was no sign of the doll in this picture. Amelia was posed with her parents, her hands resting at her sides, the porcelain doll nowhere to be found. "It's gone," Dr. Wright whispered. "Where is it? If this doll was so important to Amelia, why isn't it in any of the other photos?" Marcus leaned over, now more intrigued than before. "What's going on, Dr. Wright?" "I don't know," she replied, her voice thick with uncertainty. "But I'm going to find out." Dr. Wright sat back in her chair, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of information from the photograph. Something about the Blackwood family's story didn't sit right, and she knew that the doll, the eerie eyes, and the unexplained phenomena were somehow tied to the tragic fate that had befallen them. She opened another file on her computer, this one containing the family history of the Blackwoods. As she scanned the records, a few details stood out. Henry Blackwood, a successful businessman, had made his fortune in textiles and moved to Salem in 1910 with his wife, Catherine, and their daughter, Amelia. Their home, a grand Victorian mansion, had been the heart of their wealth and status in the community. Yet, beneath the surface of this picture-perfect family, a darker story began to emerge. Dr. Wright found a newspaper clipping dated 1910, detailing the Blackwood family's arrival in Salem. The article was filled with glowing praise for Henry's business acumen, and Catherine was described as a kind-hearted philanthropist involved in several local charity organizations. Amelia, at the time just a child, was pictured as the apple of her parents' eye. But Dr. Wright's eyes narrowed as she read further. Despite the family's outward success, there were troubling hints buried within the pages. The article mentioned that Henry and Catherine had lost several close friends in the city under mysterious circumstances. The word tragic kept recurring in the description of their lives, despite the family's wealth and stature. Tragic, Dr. Wright muttered under her breath. Was it just the tragedies that came with wealth? Or was there something more to the Blackwood story? She continued to sift through the documents, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Then she found it, a final, shocking entry. A fire. A devastating fire that destroyed the Blackwood home in December 1911, killing both Henry and Catherine. The report detailed how the fire had started late at night and spread quickly. Despite the efforts of the fire brigades, the flames consumed the house within hours. The fire's origins were unclear. Investigators believed the blaze had started in the library on the first floor, possibly caused by an unattended lamp or a dropped cigar. It was an accident, or so it seemed. But one thing remained perplexing. Amelia, the only surviving member of the Blackwood family, was found in the garden, unharmed, clutching her porcelain doll. Dr. Wright leaned forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. How had Amelia managed to escape the fire? The house had been engulfed, and there were no signs of her having exited through the door. A second-floor window, perhaps? But how could a young girl escape from a second-floor window without anyone noticing? The police had been unable to explain how she had made it out of the burning house. Amelia's account was vague at best. She claimed to have woken up to find the house on fire and had climbed out of a window to escape. But when investigators asked her how she had managed to escape so easily, her answers became confused, almost as if she were hiding something. Dr. Wright shook her head. Something about this entire situation felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Amelia's remarkable escape, the doll she had been clutching when she was found, and the tragic death of her parents. Everything seemed to be connected in some inexplicable way. She pulled up a few more documents, hoping to find more answers. The Blackwoods had been a prominent family in Salem, and their deaths had caused a stir in the local community. But in the weeks following the fire, things began to take an even stranger turn. Dr. Wright found a brief mention of Amelia in a local newspaper from late 1911. It reported that the young girl had been strangely withdrawn after the fire. Her behavior had grown erratic, and she became increasingly attached to her doll, which she named Isabelle. According to the article, Amelia would not allow anyone to separate her from the doll and had started claiming that Isabelle spoke to her. The article hinted at something deeper, something more troubling than simple childhood grief. The local community had become increasingly uneasy. Neighbors had reported hearing strange noises at night, voices coming from inside the Blackwood house when no one was there. The servants had started quitting, claiming that the house felt haunted. But most troubling of all was Amelia's behavior. She became more and more reclusive, spending long hours alone in her room with the doll, refusing to interact with anyone except for Isabelle. Dr. Wright closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture was too unsettling to fully comprehend. The fire, Amelia's survival, the doll. There was more to this story than mere tragedy. Something supernatural seemed to be at play, and it was tied to the Blackwood family, and possibly the very doll Amelia had carried so tightly in her arms that night. Marcus, who had been standing in the doorway watching Dr. Wright, spoke up. "So, what are you thinking? What happened to Amelia after the fire?" Dr. Wright glanced at him, her voice tinged with unease. "I don't know yet, but I'm starting to think that the doll may hold the key to everything." Dr. Wright couldn't shake the feeling that the doll in the photograph was more than just an antique prop. Its presence in the image, with its unervingly lifelike features, seemed to transcend the boundaries of time. She had spent hours already analyzing the photo, yet it was as though something in the doll's gaze was pulling her further into the mystery. She zoomed in once more, the image sharp and crystal clear on her screen. The doll's porcelain skin was flawless, almost unnaturally so, its face delicately painted with rosy cheeks and deep red lips. Its eyes, those eyes, still held her attention. At first glance, they appeared like any other porcelain doll's eyes, but upon closer inspection, they seemed to glisten with an almost unsettling depth. Unlike most dolls of the era which had fixed, painted eyes, this one appeared to have a subtle reflection within them, a reflection that moved with the light. "Is this real?" Dr. Wright whispered to herself. "How can it be?" The doll's features, while finely crafted, were not the only thing that disturbed her. As she scrutinized the image further, she noticed how the doll was positioned in Amelia's arms. The child gripped it tightly, her fingers wrapped around the doll's porcelain arms as if afraid to let go. The positioning felt almost possessive, as though the doll was not merely an object, but a part of Amelia herself, something that could never be separated from her. Dr. Wright's unease deepened. She ran her cursor along the doll's delicate fingers, which appeared to press into Amelia's dress, creating small, subtle wrinkles in the fabric. It was a small detail, but it unsettled her. A porcelain doll, no matter how finely crafted, should not leave impressions like this. The doll seemed to exert a pressure that, in Dr. Wright's mind, couldn't be explained away by mere artistic rendering or the weight of the photograph. Something about it felt too real. Dr. Wright glanced up from the screen, her thoughts swirling. Marcus, who had been quietly observing, stepped closer. "Okay, I'll admit, this is getting weird," he said, peering at the screen. "Those eyes look almost alive, like they're watching you." "I know," Dr. Wright said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just the eyes. Look at the way the doll is positioned. It's not just resting in Amelia's arms. It's as if the doll is holding on to her, too." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying the doll might be alive?" Dr. Wright hesitated. She wasn't ready to make such a claim, but the evidence seemed to suggest something beyond the ordinary. "Not alive in the way you're thinking, but there's definitely something off about it. I've never seen a doll like this, especially not from this era." She sat back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the image. Amelia's face, though pleasant, held a strange tension around her eyes. Despite her smile, there was something in her expression that suggested she wasn't fully at ease. The doll was meant to bring comfort, but the tightness in Amelia's face seemed to imply otherwise. "I think Amelia was afraid," Dr. Wright murmured. "Afraid of something, maybe even the doll." Marcus stepped back, allowing her some space. "You think the doll was connected to her fear?" "I don't know," Dr. Wright replied, "but I think it played a significant role in her life, especially after the fire. I've seen cases of children becoming overly attached to objects after a traumatic event, but this feels different." As she spoke, her mind wandered to the stories she'd read in the records. Amelia's strange behavior, her refusal to part with the doll, the way she claimed the doll spoke to her. It all pointed to a deeper psychological link. But there was something even more sinister at play here, something Dr. Wright couldn't quite put into words. Dr. Wright opened another file, this one containing a list of all the objects found in the Blackwood house after the fire. Among the charred remains, the doll was mentioned repeatedly. Yet it was never accounted for in the final records. According to the police reports, Amelia had been found with the doll in her arms, but it had been inexplicably absent when she was admitted to the sanitarium. Had the doll been taken away, or had it simply vanished, as if it had never existed? The fact that the doll seemed to disappear after the fire raised even more troubling questions. What if the doll was connected to the Blackwood family's tragedy in some way? What if its disappearance was tied to the strange circumstances surrounding Amelia's survival? Dr. Wright opened a new folder, this one containing the sanitarium records. She quickly flipped through the pages, searching for anything related to the doll. There it was, an entry from a doctor who had treated Amelia in 1912, shortly after the fire. The notes were cryptic, but one line stood out. "Patient refuses to speak to anyone except for the doll. Claims it is the only one who understands her." The doll, it seemed, had been more than just a source of comfort for Amelia. It had become her sole companion, her only link to the world. But why? What had the doll done to make Amelia cling to it so fiercely? As Dr. Wright sat back in her chair, She felt a chill creep down her spine. The doll was no ordinary object. It had somehow woven itself into the fabric of the Blackwood family's tragedy, and Amelia's connection to it seemed to transcend the normal attachments of childhood. "Marcus?" Dr. Wright said, her voice steady but filled with an unease she couldn't hide. "I need to find out where that doll is. We need to understand its connection to Amelia and her family. Only then will we get to the truth." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think you're right. We need to dig deeper." Dr. Wright spent the following days deep in her research, poring over every scrap of information she could find about the Blackwood family, Amelia, and the mysterious porcelain doll. The more she uncovered, the more certain she became that there was something far more sinister at work here than just a tragic family story. The doll wasn't just a symbol of childhood innocence. It was something darker, something alive in its own way. It started with the dreams. At first, Dr. Wright dismissed them as nothing more than the result of her long hours spent analyzing the Blackwood photographs and documents. But as the dreams continued, they became more vivid, more unsettling. Each night, she found herself standing in front of the Blackwood house, its once grand Victorian architecture now decayed and weathered by time. The windows were dark, the doors ajar, as though inviting her in. As she approached, a child's laughter echoed from somewhere inside, distant yet familiar. It was a soft, high-pitched sound, the kind of laughter a child might make when they were playing carefree and happy. But in these dreams, it never felt right, felt out of place. In the dream, Dr. Wright would climb the steps to the front porch, where she saw Amelia, standing alone in her pristine white dress, the porcelain doll clutched tightly in her arms. The doll's eyes, those unsettlingly lifelike eyes, seemed to follow Dr. Wright's every move. As she reached out to speak to the child, Amelia would look up, her face blank, as though she were staring at something beyond Dr. Wright's reach. Then, the doll's head would turn sharply, its painted eyes locking directly onto Dr. Wright's gaze. One night, the dream took a darker turn. Dr. Wright entered the house and followed the sound of footsteps, which echoed unervingly in the silent corridors. As she moved down the hallway, she saw Amelia in the doorway of a room, standing motionless with the doll at her side. But this time, the doll's eyes were not just fixed on Dr. Wright. They were moving, tracking her every step, as if the doll were aware of her presence, of her every thought. Dr. Wright woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. It took her several moments to shake the feeling of unease, as though the dream had bled into reality. She glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m., the same time she had woken the night before. For a moment, she wondered if the dreams were just a product of her exhaustion. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The next day, Dr. Wright's unease intensified when she found an email in her inbox. It was from Marcus, sent early in the morning, just before the archives had opened. The subject line read, "Look at this." Inside the email was a high-resolution scan of another photograph from the Blackwood collection, one Dr. Wright hadn't seen before. This new photograph showed the Blackwood house from a different angle, and what caught Dr. Wright's attention immediately was the shadow in the window. In the reflection, she could make out the faint silhouette of a small figure. Amelia, but something else was there too. A shadow, darker and more sinister, lurked just behind the child, its features obscured by the poor quality of the reflection. But it was unmistakable. The shadow appeared to be watching the camera, its eyes glowing, though nothing in the photo should have caused such an effect. "That's impossible," Dr. Wright muttered under her breath as she zoomed in on the reflection. The shadow's shape was too distinct, too deliberate. But how could it have appeared in a photograph from 1911? She had enhanced the resolution as much as she could, and yet the shadow remained, more distinct with every click of the mouse. Marcus's email included a short note. "I thought you should see this. The rest of the collection is here, but this one stood out." Dr. Wright sat back, a chill crawling up her spine. The doll, the shadow, the eerie connection. It was all coming together in a way that made no sense, yet everything was pointing in the same direction. She had known that the supernatural often played a part in the strange cases she studied. But this was different. There was no clear explanation for what she was seeing. The doll's eyes, the shadow, the unnatural presence that seemed to follow Amelia in the photographs. It all felt too real, too purposeful, as if something had been embedded in the very fabric of these images, waiting to be uncovered. The more Dr. Wright reviewed the photograph, the more she realized that there were more hidden details than she had first thought. She zoomed in on the doll's hand, the one that rested against Amelia's arm. There was a slight distortion, as if the doll's hand was not merely resting there, but actually pressing into the fabric of Amelia's dress. The more Dr. Wright stared at it, the more she felt as if the doll were reaching out, trying to communicate something, trying to pull Amelia, or even Dr. Wright, closer. Her head throbbed as she leaned back in her chair. The hairs on her neck stood up, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. The unease she felt was growing into something she couldn't ignore. There was a malevolent force at play here, one that was beyond her understanding. "Marcus," she said aloud, her voice shaking, "this isn't just a photograph. This is a warning." The more Dr. Wright dug into the Blackwood family's past, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together, but they didn't form a picture of normality. Every document, every photograph, and every record seemed to point toward a tragic tale, one that was slowly unearthing something far darker. Amelia's survival of the fire, her attachment to the doll, and the strange events that followed had all but sealed her fate in a way that Dr. Wright couldn't ignore. Amelia's life had been marked by grief and loss from a young age. The fire that killed her parents, Henry and Catherine, was just the beginning of a series of tragic events. While the world mourned the loss of the prominent Blackwood couple, Amelia's own world had come crashing down. The details surrounding the fire were murky, but one thing was certain. Amelia was the only one who survived. She had been found clutching her porcelain doll in the garden, her face covered in ash, but somehow untouched by the flames. Yet, as Dr. Wright continued to sift through the family history, she learned that Amelia's survival was not the end of her suffering. It was merely the beginning of a deeper psychological descent. After the fire, Amelia's behavior began to change. It was subtle at first, but it didn't take long for the servants and neighbors to notice the transformation. The once lively, curious child had grown quiet, withdrawn, and fearful. She began to refuse food, her gaze often distant and unfocused, and she spoke to no one except for her doll. Dr. Wright pulled up a series of medical records from the period following the fire. The records were sparse, but there was enough to paint a picture of the fragile state Amelia had been left in. She was diagnosed with acute melancholia, a condition that, according to the notes, was often attributed to children who had experienced deep trauma. But there was something more unsettling about Amelia's case than just grief. As Dr. Wright read through the notes, one entry caught her attention. It was written by a physician who had briefly examined Amelia at the time. The doctor's notes described a child who was unusually attached to her doll, to the point of refusal to be parted from it. The doll, which she had named Isabelle, had become Amelia's only source of comfort. But it was more than just an attachment, it was an obsession. "She speaks to it," the doctor had written. Amelia claims that Isabelle tells her secrets, that the doll knows things no one else can know. The child seems almost delusional in her attachment, as though the doll were her only friend, her only protector. "I fear that the trauma of the fire has caused her mind to fragment, and she has begun to believe that the doll is alive." Dr. Wright shivered as she read the words. It was clear that the tragedy of the fire had left Amelia deeply scarred, but the idea that she had formed an unhealthy bond with the doll was troubling. It was as if the doll had become her anchor, the only thing keeping her tethered to the world, even if that world was slipping further into darkness. The reports from the sanitarium, where Amelia had been placed for treatment after her behavior became too erratic for her aunt to handle, were even more disturbing. According to the notes, Amelia's refusal to speak to anyone except Isabelle had caused concern among the staff. She would only communicate through the doll, speaking to it in a soft, almost whispering tone, as if it were a real person. One report even mentioned that when the staff attempted to take the doll from her, Amelia became violent, screaming that Isabelle would be angry and hurt them if they tried to take her away. "I will never leave her," Amelia was quoted as saying during one of her rare lucid moments, "Isabelle will protect me." As the months passed, Amelia's behavior became more bizarre. She refused to interact with the other children at the sanitarium, her days spent in complete isolation with her doll. She stopped attending therapy sessions, choosing instead to speak only to Isabelle, who she believed had the power to keep her safe from harm. But as time wore on, her attachment to the doll grew more unhealthy. Some of the staff members at the sanitarium reported hearing strange noises coming from Amelia's room at night, scratching sounds, whispers, and even the sound of the doll moving, though no one had ever seen it do so. The more Dr. Wright uncovered, the more she realized that Amelia's obsession with the doll went beyond mere trauma. The doll wasn't just a source of comfort. It had become something much more. It had become a manifestation of Amelia's fear and loneliness, a conduit for her fractured mind to hold on to in the face of overwhelming loss. But what really troubled Dr. Wright was the connection between the doll and the disturbing events that had unfolded at the sanitarium. The nurses reported that the doll's presence seemed to bring with it an air of unease. Some said they felt as though they were being watched when they entered Amelia's room, even though the girl was often silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. Others claimed to have seen the doll's eyes move, shifting as if it were watching them, not just the child. The more Dr. Wright read, the clearer it became. There was something deeply unsettling about this doll, and it wasn't just Amelia's attachment to it. It was as if the doll itself were a part of the tragedy, a silent participant in the destruction of the Blackwood family. As Dr. Wright sat back in her chair, her mind raced with questions. What had really happened to Amelia after the fire? How had the doll become so intertwined with her fate? And what, if anything, was the doll's true purpose in all of this? The answers were beginning to feel closer than ever, but with each discovery, the mystery only deepened. Dr. Wright's once methodical approach to the Blackwood case had slowly evolved into something darker. The more she uncovered, the more she found herself drawn into the mystery of Amelia and the doll, as though the case itself were calling to her. The lines between professional curiosity and personal obsession had blurred, and she could no longer ignore the unsettling feeling that seemed to cling to her every time she thought about the Blackwood family's tragic past. Her dreams, once unsettling, had become a nightly torment. Every night, she found herself back in the Blackwood house, the same empty, decaying walls surrounding her. The laughter of a child echoed through the halls, distant yet near, and always, there was the doll, its eyes following her, watching her every movement. Amelia would stand in front of her, unmoving, her expression blank, but the doll's eyes would flicker, locking onto Dr. Wright's gaze with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. In the darkness of these dreams, Dr. Wright felt as though the doll was trying to communicate, to tell her something that her waking mind couldn't grasp. The more she researched, the more she uncovered. She had tracked down old letters, news clippings, and even testimonies from people who had known Amelia. Some of them had been reluctant to speak, as if afraid to bring up the tragic events surrounding the fire. But others had been eager to share their memories of Amelia, albeit with an eerie sense of hesitation. They spoke of a child who was once full of life, but who had become withdrawn and distant after the death of her parents. A child who seemed to believe that the doll could speak to her, and who grew increasingly frightened of the world around her. One particular interview stood out. It was with a former nurse who had worked at the sanitarium where Amelia had been kept after the fire. The nurse recalled how, after weeks of silence, Amelia had begun to speak again. But it wasn't just any kind of speech, it was as though she were conversing with someone else. The nurse recalled hearing Amelia whispering to the doll, "Isabelle says it's time." Time for what? No one knew. But Amelia's behavior had taken a turn for the worse shortly thereafter. She had begun to show signs of paranoia, refusing to leave her room, her eyes darting nervously toward the corners of the sanitarium, as though expecting someone or something to appear. The nurse's testimony was chilling. "I could never shake the feeling that the doll wasn't just an object to her," the woman had said. "It was as if it had a power of its own. I saw it move a few times. I know it sounds impossible, but I swear, I saw it move. Dr. Wright had tried to dismiss the nurse's words as the result of a tired mind, but the more she read, the more she realized that she couldn't explain the events away so easily. The testimony of the nurses, the strange occurrences at the sanitarium, the way the doll seemed to act as a conduit for Amelia's thoughts. All of it pointed toward something far more sinister than simple grief or delusion. One morning, as Dr. Wright sat at her desk, poring over the final details of Amelia's records, a new email arrived. It was from Marcus. The subject line simply read, "I found something." Inside the email was a single line, "You need to see this. It's important." Attached was a photograph, one that Dr. Wright hadn't seen before. It was a black and white image of the Blackwood house, but it was unlike any of the others she had reviewed. In this photograph, the house looked different. It was shrouded in a thick fog, the windows dimly lit as if something inside was alive, breathing. But what struck Dr. Wright the most was the figure standing in front of the house. It was Amelia holding the doll as always. But this time, her face was not the calm, serene expression that had been captured in the other photographs. It was twisted in a strange grimace, her mouth open as if she were screaming, but no sound came from the image. Behind her, just in the corner of the photograph, there was another figure, half-formed, shadowy, and barely visible, but unmistakably there. A tall, dark shape with glowing eyes that seemed to glimmer with an unnatural light. Dr. Wright stared at the photograph, her heart racing. The figure in the background was unmistakable. It was a shadow, but it wasn't like any normal shadow. It moved, shifted, and seemed to loom over Amelia, as though it were part of the scene but also separate from it. The image sent a shiver down her spine. "I knew it," Dr. Wright whispered to herself. "There's something here, something I'm not seeing. Something beyond the doll, beyond Amelia." But what was it? Was the doll just a tool, an object of comfort, or was it something more? A conduit for an ancient, malevolent presence that had been unleashed the night of the fire? Dr. Wright felt as though she were on the cusp of discovering something that would change everything. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. That night, the dreams grew more intense. As she lay in bed, she could hear the whispers again. This time, they weren't distant. They were close, so close that she could almost feel the breath of whoever or whatever was speaking to her. "You're getting too close," the voice seemed to say, a low, hollow whisper that echoed in her ears. "Back away, or you'll be next." Dr. Wright jolted awake, gasping for air. The shadows in her room seemed to press closer, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. She knew one thing for certain. The more she learned, the more she risked losing herself to the very thing she was trying to understand. Dr. Wright could feel the weight of the photograph in her hands, the image of the shadowy figure lurking behind Amelia, holding a secret that had remained buried for over a century. She had been investigating the Blackwood family for weeks, piecing together fragments of their tragic history. Yet, in that moment, it was as if the walls around her were closing in, pushing her toward a truth she hadn't been ready to face. She sat alone in her office late one night, the only sound the soft hum of her computer and the occasional rustle of paper as she sifted through the final remnants of the Blackwood collection. Her mind, weary from the constant flow of information, couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled in her bones. The more she uncovered, the more it felt as though something had been deliberately hidden from her, something that tied her to the Blackwood family's fate in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Then, amidst the stack of old letters and documents, she found it. A letter, torn at the edges, almost faded beyond recognition. It was addressed to a woman named Eleanor Blackwood. The name struck Dr. Wright like a thunderbolt, for she recognized it immediately. Eleanor Blackwood. That name was too familiar. It was the same name as Dr. Wright's grandmother, the same woman who had disappeared decades ago without a trace. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it possible that she was connected to this family? To the tragedy surrounding the doll and the fire? The idea was absurd, but as she read the letter, her heart began to race. The letter was dated 1910, just a year before the fire that killed Henry and Catherine Blackwood. The handwriting was elegant, but there was an unmistakable tremor in the ink, as though the writer had been on the verge of breaking down. The contents of the letter were cryptic, but they were enough to confirm Dr. Wright's worst fears. Dearest Eleanor, I cannot keep this from you any longer. There are things about our family that must be understood before it is too late. The doll that Amelia clings to, it is not a mere toy. It is a conduit, a vessel. It has been passed down through generations, and I fear that its curse has followed us. You must understand that our family is tied to something ancient, something malevolent. Amelia's fate is tied to the doll. You must protect her from it. If the curse cannot be broken, it will destroy us all. Your sister, Catherine. Dr. Wright could hardly breathe. Her hands shook as she held the letter, the reality of the words sinking into her mind. Catherine Blackwood, Amelia's mother, had known about the doll's power. She had known that it was no ordinary object, but something far darker. The doll, Isabelle, was not merely a source of comfort to Amelia. It was an anchor to something far more dangerous, something that had been passed down through generations of the Blackwood family. Dr. Wright's mind raced. What did this mean for her? How was she connected to this cursed legacy? Her grandmother, Eleanor, had been the only one left to carry on the family name after Catherine's death. But if Catherine had known about the doll's power, what had happened to Eleanor? Why had she disappeared? The letter's cryptic warning hung in the air, suffocating Dr. Wright's thoughts. She had to know more. She had to uncover everything. Every secret the Blackwood family had kept buried for so long. The answer was out there, hidden within the walls of the Blackwood house, within the very doll that had haunted Amelia's every moment. Suddenly, the pieces began to fit together. The doll had been passed down for generations, each owner falling victim to its dark influence. Amelia had been the most recent in a long line of victims, her attachment to the doll a desperate attempt to hold onto something that had long since begun to control her. But what about Dr. Wright? Why was she now being drawn into this dark web of family secrets? In a flash of realization, Dr. Wright understood. The curse wasn't just confined to Amelia or the Blackwood family. It had followed her grandmother, Eleanor. It had followed her mother. And now it had followed her. Her pulse quickened as she scrolled through the final few documents in the collection. There it was, a faded, crumpled photograph of Eleanor Blackwood, standing in front of the very same Victorian house that had burned to the ground. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and in her arms, she clutched a porcelain doll, the same one Amelia had held in the photograph. Dr. Wright's heart skipped a beat. Eleanor had never spoken of the Blackwood family or the tragedy that had befallen them. Dr. Wright's mother had often spoken of her mother's sudden disappearance, but no one had ever mentioned a connection to the Blackwood family. Yet here it was, staring her in the face, an undeniable connection to the very family she had been investigating. As Dr. Wright sat back, the weight of the revelation hit her with full force. She wasn't just uncovering the story of a lost family. She was uncovering her own legacy, one that had been buried beneath years of silence and denial. The doll, the curse, it wasn't just a part of Amelia's past. It was part of hers as well. And now it seemed it was calling to her. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and the air felt thick with the presence of something ancient and powerful. The doll's influence was real, and Dr. Wright, whether she liked it or not, was the next in line to face its wrath. Dr. Wright sat in her office, the weight of the revelations heavy on her mind. The connection between the Blackwood family, the doll, and her own family history was undeniable. She had uncovered the truth, at least part of it. But with each answer came more questions, and the more she unraveled the past, the more she realized that the true horror of the story wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what was still to come. She placed the photograph of Eleanor Blackwood on her desk, her eyes tracing the pale face of the woman who had unknowingly passed the curse on to her. The doll, Isabelle, had haunted their family for generations, a silent participant in the destruction of those who had come into contact with it. And now it seemed the doll had chosen her. Dr. Wright felt the weight of its gaze even now, though the doll itself was miles away. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. The doll had not just haunted the Blackwoods. It had followed her family through the years, feeding on their grief and fear, growing stronger with each generation. Amelia had been the most recent victim, but she was not the last. The curse was not just something that could be studied in history books or ancient records. It was something that was very much alive, and it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. Dr. Wright rose from her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to stop it. She had to find a way to break the curse before it could claim her, or worse, the people she cared about. She could no longer ignore the warning in the letter from Catherine Blackwood. If the curse cannot be broken, it will destroy us all. But as she gathered her thoughts and prepared to take action, a sudden chill swept through the room, causing the hairs on her arms to stand on end. The temperature dropped so quickly that Dr. Wright could see her breath forming small clouds of vapor in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching toward her like dark fingers. "Isabelle," Dr. Wright whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, everything went still. The silence was deafening, and Dr. Wright felt the weight of the doll's presence in the room. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, suffocating her with the unseen force that had been lurking in the background of her investigation. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed from the hallway outside her office. Dr. Wright flinched, her heart racing. She rushed to the door, her pulse quickening, but when she opened it, there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no indication of what had caused the noise. But as she stepped back into the room, she saw it. The photograph of Eleanor Blackwood, the one she had been studying just moments ago, had fallen to the floor, its glass frame shattered. The image was now cracked, but the face of Eleanor was clear, staring back at her. But there was something different now. A faint shadow, almost imperceptible, hovered just behind Eleanor in the reflection of the broken glass. The shadow was darker than the rest, darker than the room itself. And its eyes, those glowing eyes, were locked onto Dr. Wright's. The chill in the air intensified, and for a moment, Dr. Wright felt paralyzed. She could hear a whisper, low and haunting, coming from somewhere within the room, but it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking to her. "You're too late," the voice seemed to say. Dr. Wright stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She knew what she had to do, but the weight of the curse, the legacy of the doll, and the shadowy figure that loomed just beyond the edges of reality were overwhelming. She wasn't just dealing with a piece of history anymore. She was caught in the web of something far older, far darker, than anything she could have imagined. The doll had followed her family for generations, and now it was calling her. But what did it want from her? What price would she have to pay to finally end the curse? Dr. Wright glanced once more at the shattered photograph of Eleanor Blackwood, the doll in her arms, and the shadow that seemed to move closer with each passing second. It wasn't over. It had only just begun.